And if I can just get your perspective, Cheta, on this point. It just says something about the evolution of democracy in Africa. We still have this non-royal leaders and non-military leaders in power in a democratic setting for so long.
Well, the issue here is the fact that most people in this part of the world have not yet embraced, at least in their heads, Western-style democracy. We still look towards the strong man who would come and fix all the problems. So, for example, you have Togo as an example. A lot of people will look at Togo and say 12 years, but they forget that the current leadership in Togo is essentially an extension of his father's leadership, which started in 1964. Even in Cameroon, Biya's leadership is an extension of Ahidjo's leadership, which started in the early 70s. So it's that, and that's the fear with Zimbabwe now, continuity of a strong leader, in quotes, rather than building strong institutions. And the only country in the region that seems to have escaped that entirely may be Botswana. In Nigeria, where we are, what we've had is a musical chairs of the same set of people, more or less. The only outlier being Goodluck Jonathan for 5 years. So that's one thing that we have to work on, our mindsets with regard to strong institutions versus strong men.
All right. I just want to take this to our guest in Abuja. We do have Chris Nwakobia Jr. He's the convener of the Country First Movement. And Chris, if you can also share your perspective on this long-ruling African leaders in democratic settings and the big lessons we can learn from the transition that we're seeing in Zimbabwe right now, and what you think that could mean for leaders in this region. All right, I think we do have a challenge with the connection to Chris. Hopefully we can get back to Chris to get some more perspective on that point. Let's talk about what all this could mean for investments. Of course, our colleagues in South Africa have been analyzing the implications for this. And I just want to get your perspective on the type of investments that are probably still sitting on the sidelines because of this long-tenured leadership that we're seeing in some democratic settings. And I guess that there's a bit of a contrast there. If we've seen in Rwanda, many people are saying that this is a leader has been in power for well over
2003.
So very long time. And but then we don't get the same sense that foreign investors are hesitant to invest in that country. Your perspective on that point?
Well, Rwanda is a bit of a different case. People can invest in a country with a strongman leader, provided they see, number one, he's business friendly, which Kagame has been. And then he has a sort of focus. He's going in a particular direction. What we've had in Zimbabwe was Mugabe saying something and then doing something else, or being outrightly antagonistic to potential business. Now, you have a situation where a lot of the investments that come in are still related to extracting resources. And this brings up the Chinese involvement in Mugabe's ouster, or this perception of Chinese involvement. It makes very uncomfortable watching, because there's still that sense that outside interests are dictating what happens rather than the people. So are the laws going to shift in favor of those outside players? And that's going to be very interesting, because then we're probably going to see a scramble for Zimbabwe. I expect that at some point the Americans will start looking towards repealing the Sidera Acts and those kind of things. It's going to be very interesting seeing that how the outsiders are going to scramble and position themselves to take advantage of whoever is coming in next.
All right. Fifi, you want to join the conversation?
Yes, thanks. Well, in fact, I very much enjoyed what Cheta was saying that we need strong institutions versus strong men, particularly the situation there in Zimbabwe. We had a guest here in Johannesburg that was speaking about the role that citizens should play in rebuilding their country. And I just want to ask Cheta, I mean, should we have more active citizenship here on the continent to also do away with the problem of leaders overstaying their time?
Well, the problem of leaders overstaying their tenure, I think one of the first issues with that is this thing of they are not guaranteed what will happen next when they leave. Will their successors begin to witch hunt them to blame them for what has gone wrong? Now, when we have that fear, then people will do whatever comes to their minds to protect themselves. An example is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where Kabila is doing everything possible to extend his tenure in power, simply because he's not sure. There's this great unknown. What will happen next? Mugabe, back to Zimbabwe, Mugabe tried to get his wife to succeed him because there was this uncertainty about what will happen to her and by extension his family when he's gone. And that's what precipitated this whole crisis. That's uncertainty about what happens next.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have Chris Nwakobia Jr., convener of the Country First Movement in Abuja now. And Chris, I'm sure you've been listening to our conversations on this transition we're seeing in Zimbabwe. And I want to get your perspective on the role of the electorate in all of this. Now, one of the reasons why we see very little intervention from outside these countries is because there is a constitution that allows many of these leaders to stay in power for very long. And at the same time, we continue to see elections after elections. And in some cases, while we can question the legality of some of those polls, very often even the electorates tend to elect these people back into office. Your perspective on how the electorate can get involved in political transitions, and is it a question of their awareness of what's going on globally and the better experiences they can have with a change in leadership?
I think that the first thing we must note is that African leaders predominantly use poverty as a weapon in politics. They impoverish their people so that they can buy them during elections. That's the tragedy of politics in Africa. And so the electorates are almost always docile, they are compromisable, they allow themselves to be used during elections. And then after elections, the winner just goes home and runs roughshod over the people. But interestingly, the present global fervency, the movement across the world is for responsible and responsive leadership. And that's exactly what we saw when the Arab Spring came. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. As you and I talk, what the military did in Zimbabwe, for me, was very tactical. And they tried as much as possible not to ensure that it was a military coup, military coup, because the world repudiates military takeover. And then, as you and I talk, we're aware that the man in Togo is going through the heat. We're aware that the man in Zaire is going through the heat, because the time has come for people to understand that leadership is not the exclusive preserve of anybody. The time has come for Africans to understand that we must allow the will of the people. But essentially, the civil society in Africa must rise up to the ante. The electorates must understand that if you are compromisable and if you give up for a morsel of bread or a pot of porridge or a mess of soup, you give up your right to elect a credible leader, you will have to suffer for as long as the leader is in power.
Right.
But I believe that there is a moment and a monument. There is the force of zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, which is saying that Sittitism must be dealt with not only in Africa but across our world.
Right.
People must allow others to express their rights to rule and govern their people. And that is why I think that Zimbabwe is a message to the likes of Fore Ayadema, is a message to Kabila, is a message to all those Biya and those who think that their countries are their exclusive preserve and private estate. The electorate did not come up early to challenge Mugabe, but essentially they have finally done that. I saw the celebration on the streets. I saw the posturing of the parliament, the same parliament that was asleep for so long. And it is just salutary, and we must say to all African leaders who do not understand that power is indeed transient and that there are other people who can govern their countries effectively, to understand the urgency of now. You cannot continue to keep your people down in perpetuity. You cannot run roughshod over them. You cannot think that the country is your personal estate.
And Chris, what about the issue of accountability? Because Robert Mugabe right now is accused of gross violations against human rights. He's not the only African leader. Yesterday he has stepped down, but himself and other future African leaders who do step down, what recourse do we have to holding them accountable, especially as the continent's move right now is to withdraw from the International Criminal Court?
Well,
if that's to me, I didn't get you properly. I didn't get you properly, but if you're talking about the effect of human rights and how it affects the country, I think that the challenge is before the incoming leadership in Zimbabwe to understand that they must protect the rights of the people. I have seen some people who are in exile talking about the incoming president as one of the same old people, and that they cannot faithfully say that they have a new order until the elections come in 2018. People have fears that the crocodile, that's the nickname of the man who's coming in, may not uphold their rights, may not defend their rights, may walk the way of Mugabe. But I do sincerely believe that the praxis, vox populi, vox dei, runs everywhere in the world. If the people decide to defend their rights, nobody can run roughshod over them. The exit of Mugabe has taught them that the people's right is prime, proper, and right, and that the people's right must always prevail. So I think that with respect to human rights, the people of Zimbabwe must insist that the incoming administration works in tandem with the provisions of the law and protects fundamental human rights.
all right.